Hey team, welcome back to another episode of the Student Paramedic Podcast. Hey team, welcome back. My name's Alex and I'm your host today. And today we're having a chat to Todd Wehr. Now, Todd is the director for QAS's staff support service called Priority 1. And he has been a firefighter, a paramedic, and he's also done his psychology degree. So thank you for joining us today, Todd. Do you mind giving us a bit of an introduction about yourself?
Yeah. So, my background is I initially studied psychology and finished my psychology degree and felt a bit disillusioned by psychology at the time. And at that stage, you couldn't get a Medicare refund. So a lot of people couldn't actually afford it. But at the same time as I was studying, I was working in the fire service as a auxiliary firefighter, which sort of gave me some money while I was studying. And I realised that was kind of what I really wanted to be able to do, was something in that field. And then we got to know the local AMBOs, and talking to them, I thought, well, this is a great combination. I can still continue to do some more study, but also then, and still also work in a type of work that I really enjoy, which is in that, in that emergency space. I applied for ambulance and took a few years, but I eventually got a position back then as a diploma student to come through the student program. And so then I spent a number of years on road, and you do get some people that are just those people who tend to get all the big jobs. That was me. And even in my first year, I tended to get all the really big trauma jobs and those really big incidents. And it wasn't something that was that new to me, because I'd also experienced a lot of that in the fire service. And there were certainly jobs that really rattled my cage, but I still really loved the work and I still really enjoyed being a paramedic. So I spent about 14 years on road as a paramedic, and still really love the work even after, the 14 years on road. And I had lots of opportunity to do different things on road. So like work as a paramedic as well as work in different management positions. And then, and I had a few friends while I was in the service who did struggle with different things, and certainly were probably less likely to reach out and access supports. And there wasn't probably, everybody knew that Priority 1 was around at that stage, because Priority 1's been around for 30 years. So it had been around, but nobody really knew about accessing it. So I then had the opportunity to do a peer support course and realised actually this is where I really want to go. This is really in line with my values, and I can combine my understanding of on-road as well as the psych background. And so I did a master's degree, and then also, worked as a staff counsellor, and then had the opportunity to come into this manager's role when it became available. So I've now been in this role for about 6 years now. So I think having that on-road background, gives a good understanding around what actually happens, even though it's changed now, it's getting busier and busier, but it's still an understanding of what happens on road and understanding the cultural aspects, which I think can be a challenge as well. So that's kind of my background that got from where I was from to where I am now. And I think it is also that background that's made me really passionate about this. And because I know that I've been on road for a lot of times, there were certainly jobs that rattled my cage and impacted on me for a short period of time. But on the whole, I still really actually loved working on road. I still loved going to patients. I still really loved being able to do patient care. So, that didn't change even when I came off road. So I kind of missed coming off road when I did come off road. So I know that it can have impacts, but also if you do what you need to do to look after yourself, it can have, it can be a really positive experience as well. And then, after doing a lot of research around it, what we do tend to see is all of this talk about PTSD, and that it's only a matter of time before somebody's going to have PTSD, or, I do hear from a lot of people, oh, I must have some PTSD or a little bit of PTSD because I've been around, for a while in the job. But the research actually doesn't show that, and particularly when we're looking at the context of ambulance. So some of the research that gets pointed to is looking at either, there's a piece of research in America that we're looking at a bit of a combined services, and they've got such a different model of delivery and how they work. And it was very small population size. So when you start to look back at what the research actually says, it looks a little bit different. And that research, because it kept on being quoted everywhere I went, and quoted at a lot of conferences, that 75% of paramedics will end up with PTSD. First responders, sorry, the research was pointing to. So when I did track it down, yes, it was this very limited piece of research with very limited numbers of staff, and they were mixed across EMTs, firefighters, police, and the service is so different there. And then, some research in Australia actually points to, the amount of exposure to jobs that you might go to. So there's a piece of research that looks at the fact that if you go to 25 fatalities or more, then it increases your risk of PTSD. But that actual research was done looking at firefighters. And so 25 fatalities could be 20 or 30 years in the job. And they also don't sign up to do that type of work. They actually, most firefighters will sign up because they want to put out fires. And so they're actually not selecting into a role that deals with dealing with patients. So, it's very different again than when we start to compare that with ambulance, which the role is very different. We know that there's something about people who decide that they want to work in ambulance. There must be something different about them because they know that they're going to work in a trauma context. They know that they're going to experience loss and grief in the work that they do, yet they still self-select into the role. So, it suggests that there's something more resilient about them in the first place. So whether that's either a sense of self, I know that I've been able to deal with some stuff in the past and I can stay calm under pressure, or everybody says, you should do this because you're so calm, or it could be the fact that I've experienced trauma outside of an ambulance context and I know I can deal with it. So there's something different that people go, yeah, I reckon I can do that. And whereas, a lot of people, and I'm sure everyone's had that said to them, oh, geez, I couldn't do that job. And they would never even think about applying for ambulance or studying to be a paramedic. So there's something different to start with. And you kind of know what you're signing up for, but you're still signing up for it. It would suggest that there's probably a higher level of resilience there to start with. And then you undergo a whole lot of training to be able to deal with situations that are pretty tricky. And so, that training then again gives you a sense of competence and a sense of control. And I think paramedics are really good at being able to create control out of situations that are often out of control. So, and they rely on their experience, they rely on their training, and they rely on that sense of being able to stay calm. And so that's another really important component that I think keeps paramedics well in the context of the work they do. Most of the times there's that sense of control. And, even when it comes to the big trauma jobs, a lot of the times paramedics go, yeah, I've trained for this. I know what to do. I know how to deal with it. And, that somebody's got to manage this type of work, and I think I can do that. So a lot of the times those jobs aren't always necessarily confronting.
That's
We
very
do know that,
interesting though, because
yes,
even as a first year student, we get, we're exposed to our mentors or paramedic tutors that say, oh, you're going to be going to these types of cases. And we end up going on placement as a first year, for example. And I haven't personally, but other people I know have seen some pretty horrific cases. And we don't necessarily get taught in first year strategies to cope with these types of things. How to recognize signs that your cage has been rattled, or that, having a good support network is important, or accessing different supports. So, I mean, that's interesting that we get that when we graduate and you're qualified paramedic and you go through that training. But from a student perspective, what can they be doing from a first year basis to start building those coping strategies and those recognition patterns?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And because I think one of the critical components, is recognizing that there may be jobs that rattle your cage. And oftentimes it is that job where you feel out of control, or there's a personal connection, or, there's a sense of something that's compromised your values. So I think the first step to that is knowing that you having a reaction to that type of event is normal. And in fact, it's how your brain is designed to have that reaction. We've got a part in the brain called the limbic system, which is designed to activate and without your control. That part of the brain has actually kept us alive as a species. So, and we know that if it does activate, then we can clearly demonstrate that we're not psychopaths because their brains are built differently. So I think the first important factor is knowing that you might have a reaction to, the type of job that you went to, and that's okay, that's normal. And you can be in the job for 30 years and still have a reaction to a job that you go to. So it's not necessarily about time, it's how it links in with your brain and you being able to make meaning of that type of job. So, and I think when people understand that it's normal to have a reaction, I think that's helpful because they go, okay, there's nothing wrong with me. It doesn't mean that I can't cope. And it doesn't mean, that this job is wrong for me. It just means that there's something about this job that's rattled my cage, and my brain's having a very normal reaction to that. So, and when that happens, it's likely that you will think about the job over and over again. It's likely that you won't be able to sleep very well for a few days. It's likely that you're likely to feel hyper-aroused or agitated. And all of those things are just the brain doing what it's designed to do. And so sometimes people go, oh, does that mean I've got PTSD? Because all of these symptoms also are consistent with PTSD symptoms. But it actually doesn't mean that at all. It means that your brain's doing exactly what it's designed to do. And it tries to naturally work through the meaning of the incident so that, it can reach some closure. And that's part of the natural processing. In most instances, that'll last a few days. Sometimes it can last up to a couple of weeks. Sometimes it can go a bit longer. So what we do know is helpful in that context is being able to have somebody that you can talk to be able to verbalize what it was like for you, what your experience was like on the job. And that's going to be somebody that you feel safe with. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you need a psychologist to be able to talk about that with as well. Oftentimes we know it's oftentimes better for somebody to talk to a peer or somebody that they feel close with and feel safe with, just to be able to talk through the job. And then when we can talk through the job and what it was like for us in our experience of that job, then that helps the brain naturally process it. And we know that most times the brain will naturally process it. So being able to talk to it from an emotional perspective is important. So the next step is sleep is really important as well. And sometimes when we're rattled by a job, we might have difficulty sleeping. So being able to get good sleep, which is also a challenge during shift work, but being able to get that really good sleep is important because we know that there's some discharge from the hippocampus, which is involved in this limbic system activation, and being able to have that discharge can help process through the meaning. We think that's the transfer of short-term memory to longer-term memory. So then the next step is being able to do some exercise or doing something a bit distracting. Both of those things are helpful. Exercise helps burn off cortisol, and when we get hyper-aroused because of the job that we go to, we get adrenaline, and cortisol pumping around our body. Adrenaline will peak pretty quickly and drop off, but cortisol will stay there. So being able to do some exercise, and it doesn't need to be a marathon, getting the heart rate up can actually help burn off that cortisol, which in turn actually helps reduce that hyperarousal of that limbic system. And also it has, too much cortisol in our system can have health effects later on in life. So it's really important to have aspects that enable us to do some exercise, whether it's a fast walk. So, and I think it's important to have lots of different factors and to consider all of those factors. So and I often talk to paramedics about self-compassion, and they really struggle with the idea because they're often thinking about how to look after other people. But a first part of self-compassion is noticing, I'm really rattled by this, and that's okay. It's my brain doing what it's designed to do. B is that, being able to talk through it with somebody that you feel safe. C is being able to just, get some sleep. But if I can't sleep, then do something distracting. So, because your brain just wants to keep thinking about it. So being able to do something distracting and being able to have some exercise in between. So all of those factors can be really helpful. And then some people do things like, mindfulness or meditation or yoga, and all of those types of things are really helpful as well, because they help control the breathing, help you come back into the moment, so that you've got this mindfulness aspect. And help that brain go, okay, you're safe now. We can reduce this hyperarousal. And I think those things are really important. And I've heard it lots of times with students who, the first time they experience something that rattles their cage, they go, oh no, I don't think I can do this job anymore. So it's helpful to know, this is normal, and it doesn't matter whether you've been in the job for, as a student doing placement, or you've been in the job for 30 years, the same thing can happen.
That's quite interesting. That's the first time I've really heard it from that perspective of, you can have these feelings, a day, a week, 2 weeks, a couple months later. And I think I probably would have written that off as, oh, well, you've got PTSD or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And now knowing that it's actually normal and it's a normal response for your brain's quite actually really a good perspective change.
Yeah.
Especially for the first placement you ever go on, it's kind of the make or break. You either like it or you don't. You can handle it or you can't. And I think that's a really interesting perspective. Even like resilience, because it's a continuum, and people think like, oh, you've either got it or you don't have it. Is that the case, or is it not the case?
The simple answer is yes and no. So I think there is, A is understanding what resilience is. And sometimes people think, oh, well, resilience is just being able to be tough and put up with the job. But resilience is actually being able to recognize, okay, I've been rattled by something, I've been knocked down, but I can bounce back up. So back to where I was before. So I think people are naturally resilient when they come into this type of job because of those aspects that they know about themselves. So yes, I think that's important, but I also think you need to work at maintaining resilience or increasing resilience. And some of those things are like, being able to do some exercise or some type of mindfulness activities that help you give you that stress buffer. And that can be all sorts of things. Some people like meditating, some people hate sitting there quietly, so they might do some other sport that actually is a really mindful sport. So for me, I find that it's really important. There's two things I do martial arts, which helps me, you have to be mindful and in the moment to be able to do it, and I also do photography, and it's the same thing again with that. You sort of have to be in the moment. So having things like that out, and the other critical thing is that they need to be something very different to what you do in your work. Oftentimes paramedics become the identity becomes so much a part of them that when they get rattled at work, it challenges their entire identity. So having things outside of the work context is really important to be able to do that. And just being able to be, and the other thing is that self-compassion. I think once we become really self-critical, it erodes the resilience that we do have. And being able to have that self-compassion as well, and being able to recognise, that that's in order to be able to look after others, I also need to be able to look after myself as well. So I think it is something that you do naturally have, but it is something that you can also build over time. And sometimes people find it helpful to learn breathing techniques. The other thing is, if you're having those symptoms that might seem a bit like PTSD, if you're still having them for a few weeks, that's often when I recommend that somebody goes and talks to a psychologist, one of the counsellors, because it's something about that event is not enabling it to shift from the short term to longer term memory. That's all it is. It doesn't mean you've got PTSD. It's just that short term to long term memory shift. And then accessing the psychologist to be able to look after yourself. And I think it's really important. I have the view within QAS that it's when you start in the job, you're well. You even have to undergo tests to show that you're well and healthy. So being able to maintain that is really important. And part of that is making some regular appointments with a psychologist to look after yourself. And even, I've heard of people who will go before they go on holidays and say, look, I just want to make sure I'm doing okay, been to a few big jobs and just want to offload them. I think that's a fantastic way of increasing and maintaining resilience, because it's about looking after yourself in a proactive way, not waiting until you become unwell and then, hitting a wall. And they're really, there's no career impact on it. That's the other thing that a lot of people worry about, because they hear about career impacts when it comes to mental health and wellbeing. That's certainly not the case within ambulance. It is the case in other, some other first responder services, but it's not the case with ambulance. And in fact, ambulance views that as a really proactive way of looking after yourself, and actually can see that this is an important step to maintaining well-being in the job. And we have a really low attrition rate. So, the other rumor that tends to get around is, you're only going to be in the job for, I've heard anywhere between 5 years and 7 years and anywhere in between. But we actually know that the attrition rate, currently is less than 1%. So people don't stay in the job for a short amount of time. And graduates don't. The graduates, we've still got graduates who still have longevity in the job. So, it isn't the case that people leave because they can't cope. And I don't know where the rumour comes from, but I keep hearing it from everywhere. But the data just doesn't show it. People do stay, and because most people do really still enjoy the job.
I've definitely caught myself actually out saying, it'll probably be only something I do for 6, 7, 8 years. And
yeah,
I actually don't know where I heard that from. I think it was from past paramedics or from people at university. So that's actually a really interesting point that you brought up. So that's really interesting. Even your point about having a psychologist and being proactive 30 years down the line. We had a chat to Darren Hodge in one of our first episodes, and he even said to us on the episode that he has a psychologist that he goes and sees, and he's a microflight paramedic, and he does that as often as he needs. And I think that's something that I think it's a bit of a stigma is, you've become a paramedic, you should be able to just handle it, what you see. But I like that proactive approach that you talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and I will access a psychologist as well. And in fact, I have to maintain my registration. I've got to demonstrate, having accessed a psychologist. So because, the things that I will hear will be different to what most people will hear. And it's the same thing for paramedics. The things that you experience will be different to what most people would experience or consider to be normal. So, being able to have that opportunity to offload it and work through it is really just part of being able to maintain well-being in the job that you do. And it's a really healthy way of doing it, just as you would access a GP to make sure you're traveling well physically. So yeah, and I think things have certainly changed. I've been in ambulance now for over 20 years. So the attitude has changed. 20 years ago, people wouldn't have admitted that they went and saw a psychologist, even if they did. But now I'll often go to stations and people are talking about which psychologists they go and see and why. And I think that's a really fantastic place to be, where people are going, yeah, this is just about what we do to look after ourselves. And it's no different to how we would talk about our GP or our mechanic. This is all part of well-being. So the discussions are much more open about it now than what they certainly used to be. And I think, becoming more and more so.
And that's really good, actually. And I think you're seeing that in students as well. Like, we talk about it and students will be open and say, yes, we see a psychologist prior to placement and then also after placement as a more of a proactive approach as well, and are a bit more open to sharing that type of information. But yeah, I think that's a positive step for the future. I've noticed, though, in one of your CPD events that you talked about post-traumatic growth. And I was very interested. I've actually heard about that before from another graduate paramedic. And I was just interested in knowing what that is and how it applies.
Yeah, thanks for the question, because I love talking about post-traumatic growth. And oftentimes, the focus tends to be on the pathology, around PTSD and people not travelling well. But what our research actually shows us, and we've got quite a lot of research looking at Queensland ambulance personnel, and we've had a long collaboration with a professor at QUT who's actually one of the world's leaders in post-traumatic growth and understanding trauma and post-traumatic growth. And so we've been able to do a lot of research over the years. And what we've found is that more people experience post-traumatic growth than experience negative post-trauma symptoms. So symptoms of secondary traumatic stress or PTSD or even burnout. We know that more people experience this thing called post-traumatic growth. And it's not only isolated to ambulance personnel. The research has also shown it with refugees who have experienced huge amounts of trauma. It's also shown it with cancer survivors who obviously experience trauma. And a whole heap of different groups that a lot of people actually, are more likely to experience post-traumatic growth. Now, post-traumatic growth, so if we come back to resilience is about being, getting knocked down, noticing that something's rattled my cage, but then being able to bounce back up to where I was before. So post-traumatic growth is similar. It's about getting knocked down by something that really rattles your cage. So something that really shatters your view of the world and how you see yourself. So it's got to be something that's a really big event. So it will knock you down. And then part of your struggle with that is that then you come back to not just back to where you were before, but beyond where you were before. So, some of the things that people talk about when they experience post-traumatic growth is, I know that I'm much stronger than what I once thought I was, because I've been able to deal with some really big stuff and some really difficult, trauma. But I know that I was able to get through that, and not only get through that, but be able to be okay within myself. So the other thing is, people might recognize actually relationships are more important to me now, because I've seen people who have died and, they've lost those relationships. So that's more important to me now. And sometimes it also is an assessment of going, actually, maybe these relationships are not healthy for me, because I want healthy relationships in my life, because I know how short life can be. So people can change their values and their sense of who they are, which is how post-traumatic growth is assessed. And if I think back to when I first started in ambulance, it was the fact that I'd experienced a lot of trauma. As I said, I was one of those people who just experienced a lot of trauma, but it made me feel stronger that, I can manage that. I can deal with that, even though it was tough. And even though it really rattled my cage at the time, I know I can deal with that. And I know that exposure to trauma has changed me over the last 20 years, but in so many positive ways, not just negative ways. And sure, I still remember some of the jobs that were really difficult, and I can remember them pretty clearly, and I can still feel a bit sad about them. But I know that I've actually had a lot more positive growth as a direct result of trauma. And so, yeah, the other thing about post-traumatic growth is that even if you do end up, getting really rattled by things, and you can end up with PTSD, you can also have PTG as well, post-traumatic growth as well. So they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. So you can have both. But what we do know is that most people, or more people within an ambulance context, experience post-traumatic growth. Experience post-traumatic growth. So, and that's not to say, though, that people don't experience PTSD, because you can still end up experiencing PTSD, and there's a whole heap of factors that might play into that aspect. But I think if you do the right things and look after yourself, and get early access to support, we know one of the key factors is getting that early access to support. So, and that's why I think if people are going for checkups, that's a fantastic way of looking after yourself. Then you're much more likely able to prove those events to the point where you're experiencing more post-traumatic growth than you are, negative secondary traumatic stress symptoms. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. Because I've only read briefly about it before and just heard of it. So that's a really interesting way to put it, that you can actually bounce back using that resilience, I guess, or different perspective, and actually grow from those traumas that you experience.
Absolutely. And it is about, it does take that really seismic event, that really big event that rattles your cage. And yes, you're going to feel terrible because, it's really rattled your cage. But, after a period of time, people often recognize, actually, I do feel, stronger now, or more confident, or value things. I don't value, money as much as what I do relationships. So, yeah, there's that. Often, it's after those experiences that you recognize, I have changed in so many positive ways compared to how I was before those experiences. And I think when you talk to most people, they go, yeah, that really, I can really relate to that, because I do feel that way compared to how I was when I first started in the job. It's not something that's talked about widely, and it's really unfortunate, because I think pathology tends to get a bit more focus, and because we do need to have good treatment interventions for people who become unwell, who experience PTSD. But I think it's more important that we keep people well in the first place. And being able to understand that, I think, is really important in terms of, I'm not necessarily going to end up with PTSD, and in fact, I'm more likely to experience PTG. So, and I think most people can relate to that over time.
That's really good. And is going from that, I know we didn't really touch on it before, and it's probably a bit of a sidetrack, but we talk about trauma, and for our listeners who don't know what that is, or being able to define what is trauma and how does exposure to trauma actually change us, not for necessarily for the bad, like you said, but also could be for some form of good as well.
Yeah, that's a really good question too. So I think for years people have been trying to define what trauma is, and part of the issue is that it's different for everybody. And so trauma is more about your reactions as opposed to the event itself. So, for example, if you're highly trained to deal with cardiac arrest, and you go and do the cardiac arrest, you do the job really well, everything's under control, you did everything you could, even when the patient might die, oftentimes that won't rattle somebody, because they go, yeah, I did everything I could, I'm still fine with my treatment. So it might not bother them at all, and certainly they wouldn't class that as a trauma to them. So it's often when there's a personal connection, or there's that sense that this is, questioned my competency, or something about me, that's what is often considered a trauma. So you can have two people sitting in an ambulance. One person, won't be bothered by a job at all, and the second person can be bothered by it because there's a personal connection. So even if we think about, something that you go to really commonly in the ambulance, like, fractured neck or femur, an elderly patient with a fractured noff, and you get there and do the normal cares that you would. I mean, to most people, that wouldn't be very traumatic. That's a sort of run-of-the-mill job that you do pretty frequently. But if I've just lost my mother or I've lost my grandmother and they had a fractured, neck or femur, and then that might be more triggering to me than the big multi-CAS incident, because there's a personal connection. So now, that's so that wouldn't be considered a trauma in any textbook definition, but because it's so personal to me, it's more likely to rattle my cage, and therefore might be traumatic. So the definition of trauma is really hard because it's very different for different people, and that'll depend on our experiences and our sense of confidence and competency. So so I think A is that definition of trauma and knowing what it is. There are some jobs that are pretty consistent for a lot of paramedics tend to rattle their cage, that research continuously keeps showing. So oftentimes that might relate to children who are seriously injured or die. That can rattle paramedics' cages regardless of how long they've been in or their skill set. We also did some research of critical care paramedics, found the same thing. Children tend to rattle their cage as well. And often then that's about our sense of the world. And we often think, well, children should be safe. They should be protected. Even though we know things can happen to them, there is this sense of our values and how we see the world should be, that people should be safe. So that's more likely to, challenge our sense of how we see the world. The other thing is when there's something that really goes against our values. So things again like child abuse, murder, rape, that type of thing where we go, this should just not happen. That really challenges my sense of what you should and shouldn't do, or common decency or humanity. So oftentimes those things might rattle our cage a lot more as well. And so it's really important to be able to go, that is something that's rattled my cage, whether it's a big job or a little job. And maybe it's okay too that I went to a big job and I wasn't rattled by it because there was no personal connection. So, and because I often get that from paramedics as well, they go, is there something wrong with me because, I went to this terrible job, but I'm okay. Like, we did everything we could. And then people worry there must be something wrong with them. Well, no, there just wasn't that personal connection. So, and I think, again, this is back to where that self-compassion comes in, that it's okay to be rattled by something. It's okay also not to be rattled by something. It just depends on those connections. Was there a second part to that question? I think
you answered it, but it was just basically, how does exposure to trauma change you? But I think, but I think a lot of that's been answered as well.
Yeah, and I think, and if I can clarify that too, because that was a good part of the question too, and because I'm thinking, if something, if I think back to, a job that really bothered me, that was a SIDS case. It was the first time I'd experienced one. I'd only just started in the job. I didn't feel very confident. I didn't feel very competent, and it really rattled my cage. And it really, as much as I knew things happen to kids and I knew that SIDS cases occur, there was an aspect of me that goes, oh, well, that shouldn't happen. It's okay for a 90-year-old to die from old age, but it's not okay for a baby to die. So, but what that did then was, it changed my sense of the world to actually probably be a bit more realistic, that young people do die. So there was actually, it certainly changed how I viewed the world. And I think in a lot of ways it helped me be more resilient as a paramedic and be able to deal with that. So by the time I, then went to, my fourth SIDS case, it didn't rattle me. I knew I had a sense. It was sad, and it was sad dealing with the family, but it wasn't that real challenge against myself that I felt on the first one. So we know that exposure to trauma does change you, because you can't unforget what you've experienced. But that's normal, and that's okay to change you, and it's not always that negative change. As I said, it was more realistic for me, the fact that people do die, and then over time, and then you experience more jobs and you feel more resilient and more competent in being able to deal with it, and then you get that sense that like I know I've been to some tough jobs and I could deal with it, and even though the patient, wasn't a good outcome, I know I was able to deal with it, and be able to do the best that I could do in that situation.
That makes a lot of sense. And I guess everything we've talked about, in essence, requires a form of reflection to be able to look at the PTG, and then also to be, how does this case change my worldview or anything like that. Reflection seems like it's such a big and important component of preventing poor mental health.
I think that's a really important component, is that self-reflection. And I think post-traumatic growth comes from that self-reflection where you're working through those aspects. And I think that can be a challenge for people, because some people will avoid situations. So if you avoid the situation, or you avoid the emotionality, you have to a degree, to do the job. So, if I'm going into a job and I have to deal with an emotive scene, and I have to keep everything under control, I'm going to, keep my own emotions under control until I can get the job done. So, but it's then coming back to it afterwards that is the critical component, and being able to reflect upon what it was like. So either that's personally, or talking through with somebody else. And we know, things like journaling, is really helpful in the context of trauma, and being able just to journal it out. And we know being able to talk to somebody is really critical. And as I said, it doesn't need to be a psychologist. Like, it just needs to be somebody that you feel safe with. And in fact, that's often more helpful than a psychologist in those first instances. And being able to work it through and go, yeah, that was pretty crappy, but yeah, we did everything we could, and I felt like that it was really sad, and being able to acknowledge those and reflect on those emotions is what helps our brain process it through and go, yeah, okay, this is now over. And as I said, I think what oftentimes when paramedics go, I must have some PTSD, it's because they have these memories of these jobs that they went to, and because you can't unremember them. There's some big jobs that I went to 20 years ago that I remember super clearly now when I think them through. But PTSD is, it's like you're back in that moment. So, and you don't have any control of that. So it just pulls you back in that moment as if you're there at that particular point in time. You might hear the things you heard, then you might smell the things that you can smell. And that's very different to remembering, because you can't unremember it. So oftentimes I think when people go, oh yeah, I must have some PTSD, it's just the memories that they've got from experiences that they can't unremember. So being able to reflect upon those things is really important as well, and to be able to acknowledge that. So yeah, I think self-reflection, it's often talked about in clinical practice, but it's also really good for your psychological well-being. And sometimes it is even around clinical, reflection, in being able to talk to somebody who's, a clinical support officer or an educator, and being able to go, oh, like, this is what we did. And oftentimes if they go, oh, it sounds like you did everything you could, oftentimes that can be helpful as well, to be able to acknowledge, because sometimes, you just do go to a job where you go, oh, should I have done something else, or could I have done something better? Because you've now got the benefit of hindsight and time to think about it. And then often when you talk to somebody in a clinical way and they go through, it sounds like you've done everything you could, that can help also as well. So there's the clinical reflection can be helpful, and also the emotional reflection. And I think both are really important components too.
That's really good. And that's something that's been spoken about a lot by the different paramedics that we've talked to. And back to that, to Darren Hodge, who we talked to, the microflight paramedic, he even said that he continues to this day to write, 3 things they did well in a case, 3 things they did not so well or whatever. And reflection is so important. And I think that's something that we don't get taught about, I guess. And I think it's, needed, especially on placements and things like that, because whenever we get told we have to do a reflection for an assignment or something, we groan. But it's it's important, that practice, that habit's so important. Now, I'm just going to be mindful of your time because we've been having an amazing chat. I've learnt so much already. But I'd like to go through our final 3 questions that we ask every person that we have on, and it can be related to what we've had a chat about, or it can also just be related to your personal experiences as a paramedic and in your job now. But we go through the same 3 ones. So the first one is, what is the biggest mistake that you've made that's resulted in your greatest learning?
I think my biggest mistake, particularly as a paramedic in the role, was being overly perfectionistic. And I do talk to people a lot about perfectionism because it was certainly something that I struggled with a lot. So there was I had very high expectations on myself to be able to be the best, not be the best paramedic, but be able to provide the best level of patient care that I could to everybody and everything. And so what it means, though, is that you can never be perfect. And in fact, you'll always be incredibly self-critical. And I think for me, over a lot of years, that did have a personal and, emotional and psychological impact on me because it's not actually realistic. And I think it probably wasn't more until, I studied more and learnt more. Actually, sometimes it's okay not to get everything right because you just don't have the data. And it's okay to not do something perfect. And even though, because I think there's things that we need to be critical about, so in terms of patient care, but there's some things that we don't need to be. And it's being able to identify, okay, what is really important, what isn't important. And I think that also then helps with that well-being for yourself, because you just can't be critical of yourself all the time. And reality is, it doesn't matter how good a paramedic you are, nobody's going to be perfect. But I do think it is something that paramedics struggle with, perfectionism, and coupled with that comes their lack of self-compassion. So, I think being able to recognise when you're being overly perfectionistic, and I think that's also important in your self-reflection, being able to recognise what is realistic and what isn't, and what matters and what doesn't matter. And again, that's about that self-compassion.
That's a really good answer, actually. I haven't had anything like that. And you're right, it's quite everyone tends to want to not make a mistake, and that's, what we should be striving for. But you're right, you got to have some form of, it's okay to not get everything right all the time. And the second last one is, what piece of advice, just one piece of advice that you would give to a student?
It's a bit like the first one. I think that self-compassion is the critical component. I really wish that I had understood that more when I first started in the job. And as I said, I started with a psychology degree and I didn't understand that, so I really wish that I had understood that more when I first started in the job, and being able to be more self-compassionate with myself. And self-compassion is a bit wishy-washy, and people go, well, what is self-compassion? Because it's not necessarily, you can be really critical about yourself about exercising too. So that's not very self-compassionate. But self-compassion is just being able to go, yeah, this is what I'm feeling now. What's that about? How important is this? So being able to have that self-compassion enough to be able to come back to the moment and identify what's important and what isn't important. Yeah, I really wish I had have known that when I first started. And interestingly now, when I look back at people because I was really interested when I first started the job, the difference between the people who were really positive and proactive but had been in the job for 30 years and the people who are really negative and cynical. and had been in the job for a long time. So I was really interested to know what the difference was. And when I look back at it now, I think it was all about self-compassion. Those people who were really positive and really enjoyed the job even after 30 years being in it, they were much more self-compassionate with themselves. So yeah, I think it's a really good thing to know right at the start of your career, and being able to identify, what might be helpful to be more compassionate. So yeah.
That's a really good piece of advice, actually. And then the last question is, what did you used to believe to be true that you no longer believe to be true?
I think for me as well was this idea that people are going to become unwell, or that it's only a matter of time. And because that is what we tend to hear all the time. And, at an emotional level, for somebody who isn't a paramedic would look at it and go, well, that must bother you. And people say, oh, that must really be, sad, or that must be really difficult. But so it makes sense on an emotional level for somebody who hasn't experienced it. But what I do know is that you can experience trauma. And yes, it will change you, but it doesn't mean that you're going to become unwell or that you're going to have PTSD. And that PTSD is not the only outcome of that. In fact, there's positive outcomes that can occur as well, and that is more likely to occur than PTSD. But it doesn't come naturally. You do have to look after yourself. You do have to do the things that are going to keep yourself well. And self-compassion is another consideration. Jeez, I feel like I'm selling self-compassion, but I think that's okay. Another component of being able to do that. So I think that's what I've probably learned, after experiencing things. And I think for me, it was also a relief to know that, because I felt like I was okay despite having experienced lots of trauma, or what would be considered traumatic jobs in ambulance and in the fire service, that I was okay. So I think that was a relief as well to know, yeah, I'm fine. There's nothing wrong with me because I'm okay.
That's really cool.
Again, self-compassion.
No, I really like that one. Well, I really do appreciate you taking the time to come and have a chat to all of our listeners and myself. You've definitely done some myth busting and changed my perspective, and hopefully our listeners' perspective about trauma and PTSD and how to look after yourself and self-compassion. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Student Paramedic Podcast. You can connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, or you can email us at thestudentparamedicpodcast@gmail.com.